she died penniless in Paris under very tragic circumstances. And I wondered how could that happen to the daughter of a president. There was, like I said, just a couple of sentences about Eliza, and they really were rather unflattering, and they were so much the same. I came to the suspicion that that standard narrative was deliberately created.
Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
We come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And today we have a particularly intriguing subject to talk about. You know, families oftentimes have strained relations, let's say. And it's not often that you get a chance to reconcile when things have gotten past a certain point, especially not after 200 years.
Well, we have a story just like that today, Isaac, and we are very happy to have a wonderful guest, Barbara VornDick. She is an interpreter of history at James Monroe's Highland and also author of the new book, Eliza's True Story, the first biography of President Monroe's eldest daughter. Thanks so much for being here with us today, Barbara.
Oh, thank you so much for your interest in Eliza's story. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Just to give some background for our listeners, can you tell us who Eliza Monroe is?
Yes, Eliza Monroe was the firstborn of President James Monroe and his wife Elizabeth. She was born in 1786 in December.
So you're an interpreter at Monroe's Highland, so I can see why, you would learn about her and talk about her. But what about her sort of got you and you said, I've got to do more research. This woman deserves a book. Sort of what was it that grabbed you when you decided this?
Well, her story did grab me. I can tell you it didn't start out as a book. I was just sort of making notes and writing a little paper for the folks at Highland so we'd have information about Eliza. And then when I got to 100,000 words, I was like, wow, this is probably going to be a little more than that. But we're encouraged at Highland to do our own independent research. And I got interested in the women. There were two surviving daughters of the Monroes, Mariah and Eliza. So I did a little historical novel based on Mariah's sampler that she stitched when she was a child at Highland. We have it on display. That was just a fun little thing. That was really my first foray into anything really historical because I wanted the main events and things to be accurate. But, I was making up the story. Then I got interested in Eliza when I heard that she died penniless in Paris under very tragic circumstances. And I wondered how could that happen to the daughter of a president. And also, what really got me was the standard historical narrative about her, which was extremely limited. It was repeated almost verbatim in all of the major Monroe biographies. So you've got the Ammon, the Harry Unger, the Tim McGrath in 2020. It was a handful of sentences about Eliza, and they were all pretty much the same. It was like a script, and it was not kind to Eliza. The narrative was that she argued with family, stormed off in some sort of temper tantrum, and decided she would abandon family and country and go off to Europe to die, live out her life and die there. Well, by the time that happened in the 1830s, when she did travel to France, she was a grandmother, and I'm a grandmother. And I thought, you couldn't pay me enough. I don't care who I argued with. I wouldn't get on a boat and say adios and, leave all of that. And so it didn't make sense. And our executive director at Highland, Dr. Sarah Bonhoeffer, told me one time, when things don't make sense, ask big questions. So I asked, maybe this isn't right. So that kind of got me started.
Yeah, that feels like a youthful thing to do. Not something you do as a grandmother. You're totally right. That is curious. And Lynn, is that often a red flag when you're reading through different biographies of folks, when it seems like a story is almost too scripted?
Yes.
That they're just quoting other books? Is that something that happens
and
often?
I think Barbara would agree with this. And I think this is why, honestly, if you want a good biography, it takes years, because the thing is, there's so much that you need to research. I mean, how long did it take you to research this, Barbara? When you think about,
Hmm.
you're focusing on this one event. So you have if you have a 300-page biography and you have to double check every single fact about their life, which ideally you do,
Yes.
that's going to take years and years and years. So,
I did it in 5 years. That was pretty much, from the first sip of my morning tea till I was bleary eyed at night and realized it had gotten dark. I had forgotten to eat and I was still in my pajamas. So,
I
um,
know that feeling.
and, and being retired, I was able to do that, to devote
Mhm.
that amount of
Mhm.
time. But it was so fascinating. Once I got into it, it was so fascinating. And I understand that the biographies about Monroe are about Monroe. So the
Right.
children are peripheral, of course. They give a good nod to his wife, as they should. But the children, there was, like I said, just a couple of sentences about Eliza, and they really were rather unflattering, and they were
Mhm.
so much the same. I came to the suspicion that that standard narrative was deliberately created.
Deliberate.
That's my
Interesting.
that's my opinion based on
Mm.
what I found, and I believe there was a reason for that. But I didn't put that in my book because I want readers to see what they think, and perhaps come to
Sure.
that conclusion. But it was quite startling.
Well, let's definitely save that revelation
Yeah.
for the end of the episode so the listeners have to listen to the entire interview in order to find out what the conspiracy is or maybe.
Yeah, because we want to go back and start from the beginning so that we can get to know Eliza, so that when
Yeah.
you get to that point, we'll understand why the narrative that had been accepted didn't make
So
sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
Lynn, do you want, or actually, Barbara and Lynn? I sometimes default to Lynn for some background information, Barbara, but obviously, since working at
Yeah.
Highland, you are well qualified to do this. Do you want to give us just James Monroe isn't in like the top 5 most familiar presidents? Like, what if I
Yet.
were to give him like 3 bullet points? Like, who is Monroe?
In many ways, a self made man, in that he was orphaned at the age of 16. He had been comfortable growing up, but he was not born into wealth. He was able to go to college because his uncle sent him. That's I think one important thing that impacted him, and I believe it kept him very grounded throughout his
Hmm.
life. He didn't die in debt. He liked to pay his bills. He was grounded that way. Another thing is he was very devoted to family and country. When he traveled, he always kept his family with him. He had several overseas assignments, held more elected positions than any president before or since. So there was extraordinary devotion there. And he did many things to advance America. He was a founding
Hmm.
father, sometimes called the last of the founding fathers. He was, let me just say, he wasn't flamboyant. He wasn't, quick, maybe with conversation, sort of, funny, whatever. But he was steady. And I think that really paid off because when he negotiated with Napoleon, for example, it ended up being the Louisiana Purchase, which helped us out quite a bit, double the size of the nation, and the Monroe Doctrine, that kind of thing. Oh, and the other point, he fought the Revolutionary War.
Mm.
So he's one of the only presidents who did that, and founding fathers. So that's important, I think.
Yeah. I mean, fascinating guy. Jefferson gets all the credit
Yeah.
for the Louisiana Purchase, but people who know Monroe are like, well,
Monroe
mm,
negotiated it, and then
yeah.
had to tell Tom what he did, So,
Yeah, exactly. And then he gets the credit. And also, another trivia that I love is that he also died on a July 4th.
oh, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Who is killing off these presidents on July 4th? What is?
I know.
Why does it keep happening?
Don't take food or drink from strangers on July 4th. Yeah.
I made this joke once before. I think it was when we were talking, doing a site spotlight, Lynn, which is a feat, something that I'm going to tease that will be coming out next season. Listeners, keep out for that. That Monroe does live beneath Jefferson's tall, skinny shadow.
Yes.
Like a very thin shadow, but it's a very tall one. So he had lots of accomplishments as a president and in public service. But what was he like as as a husband, as a dad? What was he
Yeah.
like at home, like as a family man?
Well, he did some homeschooling with Eliza.
Mm.
Eliza wrote about that. She was learning geography and science from her father.
Oh, that's interesting.
Between when she did attend some formal settings, but
Hmm.
he did work with her there. His letters to her are very, very endearing. My dear child. They're always addressed that way. By all accounts, there was a wonderful romance between he and his wife. There was 10 years difference in their ages. When he married, he was 27, she was just 17. He was obviously very devoted to her too. If we get into the White House years, he was very devoted to her at that time, trying to protect her health at that time. He also brooked no nonsense, so he was very honorable, and honor was very important to him. Someone called him a liar, and he challenged them to a duel. They didn't end up dueling because Monroe's guy worked it out with the other guy's guy, and they didn't end up dueling.
Hmm.
But still, that was a personal affront. And he had the guts to write a 400-page book saying why President George Washington, was wrong and he was right uh, when he went to negotiate a treaty in France, and Washington basically fired him and pulled him back in 1797. And Monroe sat right down and just wrote, oh yeah, kind of a thing.
That's one of my favorite
Is
little
it?
anecdotes from presidential history, that
Yeah.
particular thing. And because
Mhm.
we Lynn and I do a lot of work in the Washington space, and
No.
Washington's personal copy has lots of annotations and or
Yeah.
marginalia. I've been
Not true.
commenting on it. Yeah. But he never said anything publicly about it. I think it's very funny that he's like seething reading this thing,
Right.
but never really mentioned it outside of that.
I envision
Um,
it as emails going back and forth. Monroe writes this, and then Washington gets it, and he's writing in the margins.
yeah,
That's not
Yeah,
how
like
Washington
it
would have
is.
been like subtweeting if social media had existed.
the
Like
little
not
passive aggressive. If you had read my previous email.
yeah, not tagging him in it specifically, just writing
Right.
long posts on Facebook without tagging him.
You know when you hire a guy and you send him to France,
People just don't listen. It's so hard. People, this next generation, they just don't know how to
Yeah.
work.
This is what happens when you make a guy minister plenipotentiary.
Look what
Right?
happens.
Meaning he can
Can't
do
trust him.
whatever he wants on behalf of the country. And now look what happened.
This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like-minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primary source media. That's patreon.com/primary source media. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show. Oh man. So I think that's really interesting that he tutored Eliza. That not many at least Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, but not many women were schooled in those subjects for
Well,
very
they
long.
they were usually tutored in things like, dancing and,
Yeah.
but they would be tutored enough, I think, that they could and Barbara can correct me, uh to have intelligent conversations, but
Yes.
they were never going to
But by the
work in that
fathers
like you would.
usually? I thought that was sort of like a mother's job to
Wh-
tutor them into a certain point
Well,
at
yeah,
night
as
or
far
whatever.
I don't know. I mean, Jefferson, Washington, they all had tutors for their children.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know any. I can't off the top of my head think of any who actually did it themselves, like you're saying Monroe did. I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty
That's very cool.
dedicated.
That's
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
I didn't hear anything or read anything about a tutor at any
yeah,
Huh.
time for either of the girls. Well, their mother was very well educated as well. She was from a wealthy family in New York. And so she was very savvy. She helped her father run
hmm
a business, and she was very gutsy too. So I think Eliza was blessed with parents who were very intelligent and wanted to give her a
right.
good education. But you're right, Lynn, that the education that most girls got at that time was just enough so that they could converse, in social functions and things like
Right.
that. Not for a career or anything. They certainly weren't usually educated to the point where they had a solid background in any one thing.
Right. It
Right.
was about, playing the piano, social niceties, dancing. Those were
Mhm.
the important things
Hmm.
Mhm.
for women to learn at the time. Yeah.
So did she? How did her, life progress from that point? Like, obviously she's being educated a little bit and by her parents, or more than a little bit. Did she then? You said she was a grandmother, so she obviously went through, courtship and got married at some point.
Yes,
Right. And definitely we want to talk about her in France, like the first time she went to
Oh yeah,
France.
yeah. Oh, she went to France with him when he was younger, or when
Right.
she was younger.
two
Yes.
trips.
Two
Hmm.
trips. Oh, okay, okay.
And
Interesting.
yeah, that's a total of 7 years. And during those years, she was educated at Madame Campan's school
Hmm.
in Paris. It was a prestigious boarding school.
Hmm.
And, Caroline Bonaparte was one of her, friends at the boarding school. She also met Hortense de Beauharnais, who ended up being the stepdaughter of Napoleon because her mother was Josephine, even though that hadn't happened yet when Eliza met her as a child. They were both children at the boarding school. That
Hmm.
friendship continued their whole lives, and I think that was very influential on Eliza. But her education was very sound at Madame Campan's. There was a lot of assumption that that was a very, elite sort of hoity-toity kind of school. But my research into the school, because I wanted to see if that assumption about Eliza was well founded, and it was not. Madame Campan's school was, of course, academic in focus, but Madame Campan also felt very strongly that her job was to prepare these young girls to be able to function if they lost everything. And Madame Campan
Oh, that's interesting.
Oh.
was a lady in waiting to Marie Antoinette, so she had seen what had happened to Marie Antoinette. So she required her girls to know how to wash and take care of their clothes. Their dresser drawers were open for inspection at any time. She made them prepare meals and carry them to the poor 3 or 4 times a week.
Hmm.
It
Wow.
was not what a lot of people assumed. And the awards that were given at the school centered around virtue, not
Hmm.
about academics so much, even though they certainly were well acquainted with academic subjects. So it was a really interesting choice, I think, of school that James and Elizabeth Monroe made. And I think it held Eliza in good stead.
Okay, so it's not what I was picturing, which is I guess the scenes from the Princess Diaries where she's
Yes.
like trying to learn how to walk around with a teacup on her head or whatever.
Yes.
Um,
Very
that's
different.
yeah, that's interesting. So the previous assumption was that it was sort of some sort of cushy kind of school for the elite children to kind of socialize and hang out and learn fancy things.
I think that assumption was made by Americans. In fact, Monroe's uncle actually was a little concerned about her attending school in Paris because he was afraid she would, get airs or something. And Eliza told her father to write back to him that she would return as as good a wholesome American as she was when she left. So
Nice.
yeah, I think that's interesting. But I think Americans just made assumptions. And then when they learned that her friend Hortense was the stepdaughter of Napoleon, I mean, people just went crazy because, we fought a war, to get away from royalty and stuff. And now, when Monroe was president, people found out that Eliza's good friend was Napoleon's stepdaughter. And yeah, that did not
Hmm.
bode well, unfortunately. They just made an assumption.
Well,
Right.
everything in with a French name sounds fancy, so
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's
probably.
true.
Yeah. So, Lynn, do you want to walk us through any questions you have, like furthering her life down the timeline?
Right. So I'm not sure which you want to start with, but I'd love to talk about, her getting married and having children.
Mhm.
But then also you focus a lot, which I think is fascinating in her book about how caring she was, as in she cared for her mother, who was James
Mhm.
Monroe's wife, was very ill, especially when they were in the White House. So I'm really interested for you to talk about her personality in that way and how she almost seemed like she was a nurse. I mean, that could have been her career if she had been born a little later, but also about her family. I mean, her marriage and then her own children. So I'll let you decide in which order you can tell
Okay.
us about those.
Um, okay. Putting it in order here. Um, when the Monroes returned from their second trip, their last trip as a family to Europe, Monroe had been minister to Spain, France, and Great Britain on that trip.
Oh,
Eliza had been in school a couple years finishing up. By that time, her friend Hortense had married Napoleon's younger brother Louis, and so Eliza had been at least one function with the royal court. She was 20 years old. This is 1807 when they got off the boat in Norfolk Harbor, I believe it was, and they were greeted with a huge amount of ceremony. Parades and receptions were being held for them. So Eliza, at this point, she's 20 years old. One person wrote how much she had improved in grace and her deportment. And I believe that's when it struck her really as to her father's position in the
right.
United States and what he had done for his country. A year later, she married George Hay, who was a prominent district attorney in Virginia. He was 22 years older than her. She was
Whoa.
just 22. He had two children already. He was a widower. And the two children were almost Eliza's age. But from my research, what I found, they were very well suited. He was so fond of her, always spoke in wonderful, wonderful terms about her, including about her nursing skills.
Mm-hmm.
So the nursing, the compassion for her family, I think she demonstrated through her nursing skills. She was always
Right.
being called to family members' houses, family relations of George Hay, her husband. She would go and take care of their children. She nursed her father through the last 10 months of his life until he died from tuberculosis. She went to John Calhoun, Monroe's, what position was he? Anyway, sorry, he was in Monroe's cabinet, uh, Secretary of War, maybe. Anyway, in Washington during the presidential years, she went to his house because they
Mm-hmm.
had a sick child and offered to sit up at night. They were saying, "You're busy. No, you don't have to." And she insisted. And Monroe himself said, "Let her stay. She's the best nurse you can have."
Oh.
So she went there at least 4 times and stayed with that child. And as you mentioned, she nursed her mother really through the last 13 years of her life.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it was very interesting. Even in the White House, did she kind of serve as first lady, even though she was first daughter?
Exactly.
Hmm.
But Eliza moved into the White House when Monroe became president, 1817, and he ended up serving 2 terms to
Hmm.
1825. So Eliza knew of her mother's condition. Her health had started to decline in her 30s. So
Hmm.
she wasn't up to the rigorous social functions required for First Lady. So Eliza moved in with her family and was there for the 8 years. And a lot of people seem to resent that she kind of, there were reports of her, she's just taking charge and she's just walking around. She's so bossy, in the White House. But I believe that structure they set up, they formalized the protocols. They brought it down from Dolly Madison's "y'all come in"
Hmm.
to a more formal structure of visitation and things like that. And I believe that was a concerted effort by 3 people: James Monroe, his wife Elizabeth, and Eliza. And I think
Interesting.
they created that to protect his wife's health because her conditions included debilitating arthritis and what we now know was epilepsy.
Oh my gosh.
Hmm.
So I think they wanted to keep that hidden. In those days,
Ah.
there was a whole lot of nonsense, about it, called the falling sickness. So the interaction for Elizabeth Monroe was was more limited, and so Eliza took her place. I think some of the elites felt snubbed by that. The press kind of went
Mm.
crazy. They assumed that Mrs. Monroe didn't want to mingle with the little people, and so they dubbed her Queen Elizabeth, and
Mm.
all of this nonsense. The press just kind of went crazy with it, but they stuck to it, and I give Monroe a lot of credit for that because it actually was brought up in 2 cabinet meetings, and he didn't budge. Kept it that way, and I believe that was part of his devotion to his wife.
And this is all because his wife is ill. And so Eliza's stepping up and doing more. And then
Mm-hmm.
they don't know that the wife is ill. So they're just saying, oh, look at this snobby daughter keeping us out of the White House, keeping us from what Dolly Madison allowed us to do, essentially.
I think so. After a couple years, I think a little bit. I saw a little mention of it in some personal letters of society from society members, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, the Margaret Bayard Smith, the wife of a editor in Washington D.C., she finally wrote, listen, the woman's not able to do these kinds of things because of her health, and her daughter is assisting with this. Get over it, basically. She said, not in those words, but it was kind of like, just everybody, can you just let this go?
Right.
So I gave her some kudos for that, for saying that.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, so nothing you've said so far. I'm just trying to piece together this relationship and this
Mhm.
woman in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Points me to think of like, oh yeah, this person is going to sort of detach themselves from their family and is somehow not engaged or responsive with what those are like those who are close to her.
Right. She sounds like an amazing
Yeah,
family member. I mean,
right. Yeah, that was doing an important work and had a lot of responsibility and does that change or is this?
That's really interesting. I came to the conclusion after my research that she really, I think Eliza had a lot of qualities that we would admire today in a
mm-hmm.
woman, but that things that were not admired then. Um, she was well educated. She had opinions. I think she spoke them. I don't think she tolerated just idle conversation, sort of
Mm-hmm.
very well. She liked meaningful conversation, I think. And I also think that for her in the White House, she may have been a little brusque at times, from what I found.
Mm-hmm.
But all of the negative things that were written about her, John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, wrote that she was a little firebrand. I dug and dug to try to find why people said that, because these comments would be written or in diaries and letters and in the press, but no examples were given.
Right.
So I wanted to know, I mean, if she was that way, if she was cantankerous, I needed to know that as an author. And I wanted to know about her, all of the aspects of her character. And I couldn't find them. I couldn't find examples of that. Quincy Adams didn't say, John Quincy didn't say she's a firebrand because remember that time she did this and that. I couldn't find that, but I found a lot of evidence for the nursing skills. I found the
Mm-hmm.
evidence of her planning her sister's wedding because her mother wasn't up to it. And people
Right.
didn't like that either because she limited the attendance. And oh my gosh, it was a huge deal. So the elite society was outraged about that in Washington because they thought they should be invited. And I found a combination of things in my research, but the actual examples of her actions is what I was looking for. And they seem to be very positive.
And it could be that she was just acting more the role of a man. I mean, it could be that instead of being,
Mm-hmm.
demure and quiet, she's speaking up, and they saw that, and they said, "Oh, she's a firecracker because she has to speak up too."
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, that it could just be what they call firecracker, just like you said, things that today would say, "Oh, she's great," but back then were not looked as kindly upon. Otherwise, wouldn't we have examples? Like she threw a desk, you know? If it was something extreme.
Right, or caused a ruckus. Yeah, so like the scenario that it was presented as sort of like the commonly accepted narrative is kind of extraordinary, right? A grandmother throws away like her whole life to go live, every connection that she has to go live in Europe.
Mhm.
Um, and that requires an extraordinary amount of evidence or justification on the other side.
Thank
And
you. Yeah,
I'm just not seeing it.
thank
Unless
you.
you start to look at the people who didn't like her starting when she was in the White House, and they start everything she does, they're having issues with.
Yeah.
So then if you're thinking, if they're the ones creating this narrative,
Well,
these
Lynn,
people that have already disliked
don't
her.
spoil who the perpetrators may have been.
Right.
We haven't even gotten
I know we haven't gotten there yet.
gotten
Let
there
me
yet.
not jump ahead. So let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. Primary sources. So you said, you're looking for these things, and what are you looking at? You're looking at letters. What are you looking at? Where did you go? Did you go to, like, I'm sure Highland has some things, maybe university libraries. Where were you looking for your sources?
All of the above. Um,
And more, right?
but yeah, National Archives, of course.
Mm-hmm.
The Maryland State Archives. I visited there, waded up to my elbows in old moldy wills in boxes, trying
Oh,
to find her original one. I did find the will of Johns Hopkins, though, actually from
oh,
1837. But that's a tangent. If I start going off, you got to bring me back because yeah, the historical research I just found was fascinating. It was my first really deep dive into this. And
oh,
boy,
yeah,
the
that's
little
fun.
tidbits were just, tantalizing. But personal letters, of course, a lot of court documents. I found transcripts of court proceedings really fascinating, especially when it came to her family members. So a lot of those deeds, ships' manifests were very revealing. I found Eliza that, but if I back up, the first narrative about Eliza was that in 1834, which was just 3 years after her father died,
Mm-hmm.
she went to Europe and then stayed for 7 years, abandoned everybody, and died in Paris 7 years later. But I found her on a ship's manifest returning a year after she left. She returned to America in 1834. She arrived at the port of New York in on July 17th, 1834, on the Francis de Poe. So I quickly got in touch with Daniel Preston, who at that point was in charge of the Monroe Papers at the
Right.
University of Mary Washington. I'm like, did you know about this? Because I just found this document. And it was interesting. He replied that he knew she had returned at some point. She hadn't just stayed the 7 years overseas, but that information evidently wasn't out there. That wasn't disseminated because the Monroe biographies were still
Mm-hmm.
printing about Eliza. But I think that's a really important piece.
Right.
She didn't end up leaving the country again until 1838. So when I was finding all of this out, you see how that standard narrative about her, there were holes being punched in it continually with little
Right.
things that I would find.
As far as you can tell from your research, why did she go to France? What was the reason?
She wrote that she had been advised to take a sea voyage for her health.
Oh,
And, she had taken care of Monroe for 10 months. We know he died of tuberculosis. My research also found evidence that she stayed and took care of her daughter,
Oh.
and that's all new information that came to light. Took care of her daughter until she died at the young age of 25 or so
Mm.
from tuberculosis.
Oh
And it
gosh.
was after that she was advised to take a sea voyage for her health. Well, there's always been, I grew up with the thought that sea air is better for you, especially if
Right.
you have lung trouble. So I suspect she had something going on.
hmm.
But she wrote that that's why she left. None of her letters included anything about this argument, and she certainly, by the way, you'll find it in Monroe biographies that when she got to Paris, she became a nun and died in a convent. That's absolutely not true either.
What?
Yeah.
Huh.
So, yeah,
because
why? Where did that come from? Yeah, that's nonsense.
because her husband had passed away as well, correct?
Yes.
So
So
she's lost her
her
husband, her father, her
her
mother.
husband and her mother died within 2 days of each other.
Oh my.
Bam
Uh,
and bam. She had been taking care of her mother, who was near death. Her husband was ill. He went for treatment. On his way back, he got too sick and had to pull over at the house of the Clark family in Albemarle County. That was September 21st that Eliza was summoned. She went there but didn't make it in time, and he died on the 21st of September. While she's
Oh.
there, she gets a message, hurry back because your mom's dying.
Oh.
And she tried to get back with her husband's body, and her mother died on the 23rd, 2 days
Oh my
later,
gosh.
before Eliza got back. Ammon, the Ammon biography of Monroe says that she just made it back in time to see her mother. The other biographies say that she did not make it in time. Either way, 2 days, bam, bam, she got hit with both of those. And then 10 months later, her father died.
Oh
So
gosh.
within 10 months, she had lost her husband, her mother, and her father.
This story of the arguments with the family is making less and less sense. Who was she arguing with? They had all just died. they were they had all just died. There weren't any left. Yeah,
Yeah, there
Yeah, who's she arguing with?
you go.
yeah. Who was she arguing with?
And by 1838, when she made her second trip, her daughter had died as well, but she was at that time at the home of the son in law. I believe she was raising the grandchildren because
Mm,
there were five. There were three direct grandchildren, and her daughter's husband had two from a previous marriage. So there were five children, one an infant, a 2 year old, a 4 year old, and then children like ages 10 and 14 in there. I
Mm-hmm.
believe Eliza stayed there until 1838. So she was with the son in law. I found no evidence of a argument there. I found letters written between the two of them before she went there to live. I think Eliza was writing to him things like, make sure she wears her cloak, be sure she keeps warm.
mhm.
It's wintertime and all of that. I didn't get any pushback from him in
Mm-hmm.
letters. Some people might have thought she was a little overbearing, but also Eliza's husband, George Hay, was writing to the son in law, Lloyd Rogers, and they were very nice letters. They seemed to have a really good relationship. So I didn't find any evidence, but that would have been the person, unless at that point her sister and her sister's husband maybe had visited or were writing to her from New York. They lived in New York. So if maybe they were in touch somehow, those letters were likely destroyed.
Okay.
I could be wrong. They could be in New York somewhere, still with family, but I didn't find any of those. But Eliza had never gotten along with that brother in law.
Okay.
So maybe there was an argument there. I don't know.
Right. So she loses within 10 months, she loses her husband and both parents.
Hmm.
And then she goes to Baltimore, which is where her son in law is living with the grandkids. And she's helping him out, take care of them.
Hmm. That's,
And
yes,
and it's from there that she goes to France.
yes.
Okay.
Because, and there's a, I don't have a direct statement about
Mm-hmm.
that, but when you pull together her last documents, so for example, her passport that she got
Mm-hmm.
before taking that 1838 trip, that passport, her residence is listed as Baltimore, which is
Mm-hmm.
where her daughter's home was and her grandchildren were.
Right.
When you put that together, the fact that Eliza was always there with her daughter, for delivery of babies and things. As I said, she had returned from Europe on the Francis de Pau for the second birth,
Mm-hmm.
the second grandchild's birth. Then her daughter had another grandchild. So if you put everything together, I do believe she stayed there. There's also no letter that I could find, correspondence with friends or anything, for those 4 years from 1834 to 1838. Many of the letters I found were between Eliza and her daughter. Of course, her daughter had passed, so they
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have been writing letters. And as
Right.
you mentioned, Isaac, her immediate family members had passed, so she wasn't writing to them.
Right.
No letters ever been found that anyone knows of between Eliza and her sister Mariah. So
Oh, wow.
I don't think that's unusual that there was no correspondence there. But
Right.
there wouldn't be a lot of correspondence if she's in one place and she's taking care of grandchildren those 4 years. So sort of everything came together to strongly support, I should
Right.
say.
And it fits her personality from what you found for the rest of her life.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. Mhm.
So, because I want to address a more recent happenings at the end of this episode, where did this story come from? Why is this idea that she, had this argument, said, forget you all, I'm gonna go live out the rest of my days in France? Where did this come from? Why was it perpetuated?
And what was the argument about, if we
Yeah.
know?
I don't know of the argument. I didn't find anything direct. I have my suspicions that this may have been created sort of as a smokescreen
Mm-hmm.
because it ended up that Eliza never received 1 cent, and that's her words, 1 cent of the inheritance due her from her father. She had to hire lawyers to try to get it for her, so she spent the money from her husband's uh, property
Mm-hmm.
on the lawyers. When she was in Paris, she was awaiting that. We're talking that last trip to Paris. She was awaiting that money, and she was just sinking deeper and deeper in
Mm.
debt because she had not gotten it. And that ended up being a large part of my research because Eliza wrote in her last letters exactly what happened
Hmm.
and who had stolen her inheritance. But I would not sully a man's reputation, alive or dead, unless I knew it to be true. And it's not that I didn't believe Eliza in her
Mm-hmm.
letters, but I needed proof.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a lot of the court documents and things came in because I can prove it. And this was new information.
Oh,
And I needed to be sure. I ran it by a lawyer because
nice.
I was advised to check with a lawyer because so I didn't get sued. Um, but I do have the documentation, and I was assured I can't be sued over saying something about a person who's dead. But I still wanted to have all my ducks in a row before I printed it. But it
Sure.
had to be printed because I think that it was easy to say, oh, she willingly left. She left us. She didn't want anything more to do with us. Why should we send her any money?
Mm-hmm.
That's my opinion. That's
Mm-hmm.
my interpretation of what I have researched. Um, that might not be correct, but otherwise, I mean, I can't think of another reason why this
Right.
got started. I haven't found the evidence for all of this obnoxious nature of Eliza and all this quarreling and everything. I just didn't find it.
Wait, so did I miss who it was that I
You
was able to
did.
get a hold of?
Do you want to know?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. It was her brother-in-law, was her sister's husband.
So Mariah's husband?
Hmm.
Interesting.
Monroe had appointed him executor of his estate.
Wow.
Oh.
If we back up just a wee bit, when Monroe's wife died, he was so grieved. One account says that he actually jumped into the grave and held on to the coffin and said he wouldn't leave.
Oh
Oh
my
my gosh.
gosh.
The two sisters decided that he had to get away from there. That was at Oak Hill at the plantation in Loudoun County.
Uh-huh.
Right.
So he went with Eliza and Mariah because Eliza, she's a widow now.
Mm-hmm.
So she went with her father and Mariah's husband back to their home in New York. So Eliza lived there for some time, taking care of her father. In Eliza's letters, she wrote that Samuel Gouverneur deliberately refused to take her father's will, to accept his dictation of his will, until he was so debilitated that he was not able to make a will as he would have. Now, she accused him of that.
Right.
Eliza was there. She was taking care of her father, so she was
Mm-hmm.
there. She was a witness to that. I don't have proof from anyone else about that. I do have the primary. I do have the primary source of her words saying
Mm-hmm.
that. I also have Monroe's will, and it's rather interesting to me that the will of this man who had held all of these positions, so well educated, had property worth quite a bit at the time of his death, wrote a will of only 5 short sentences.
Mm-mm.
And I'm like, yeah, really? I
That's
don't know.
very atypical of the time, right,
Oh,
Lynn?
yeah. Oh, my
Oh, I
gosh.
have read wills from the Eliza's will is pages and pages, and the grandchildren. And if one gets married before I die, and then if they don't get married, and they just like, ay, ay, ay.
Yeah.
Yeah, five short sentences. The 2 girls were to get half of his property split evenly. The 2 sisters, Eliza and
Hmm.
Mariah. The papers and his autobiography, the proceeds from those were to be split 3 ways: a third to Eliza, a third to Mariah, and the other third to Samuel Gouverneur as
Mhm.
executor. So, in essence, Mariah and Samuel Gouverneur got 2/3,
Right.
and Eliza got one
Right.
third in that
Right.
deal. I'm like, hmm. So,
It's fishy.
I just found that all kind of interesting.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's what Eliza wrote, and she even spelled out what he was doing with the money and how he had sold some of the property of James Monroe's and not given her a cent for it. She was completely cut out of that deal. So this is where I was digging through court records.
Right.
Mhm.
And a historian that's now at Montpelier was doing some research on the enslaved that Monroe had owned, and found a document. Get this, in New Orleans. It's not in the Loudoun County court
Huh.
in those documents, but it was in New Orleans where Samuel Gouverneur and Mariah had sold all of the enslaved at Oak Hill shortly before Eliza died.
Oh,
She's waiting for money, and
right.
I have the bill of sale for $25,000 in those times. Was an extraordinary amount. You'd have to
Oh,
multiply that by about 35 to
right.
get a figure now for what that would be worth. Eliza, as difficult as it is to say that the enslaved were property, Eliza was due half of that.
Mm-hmm.
But why? Why did they keep that money? I'll tell you why. Because a couple months before the sale, Samuel Gouverneur had been found guilty in a federal court of misappropriation of government funds in his job as postmaster of New York. Andrew Jackson was involved in this. Andrew
Oh,
Jackson, I have an affidavit. He washed his hands of it and left Samuel Gouverneur out to dry.
oh.
And
Huh.
he was accused of mismanagement to for $103,000 in those days, which you're talking like in over $1 million
Oh,
in
yeah.
today's money. Now, he managed throughout the trial. I've read the transcript. Throughout the trial, Gouverneur, he was able to. Gosh, the guy could. Yeah, he just. I'm sorry, I digress. But man, could this guy negotiate? Or wow, he got that down to 26,000 by the end. He
Okay.
Okay.
was found guilty. His penalty was 26,000. He sold all the enslaved bingo and got 25. Sure, I could be wrong, but I strongly suspect that money was used directly to pay his and meanwhile Eliza's dying in
Yeah.
Paris. He's also I can place him at the track, the horse
Oh,
track
my gosh.
in Maryland. I can place him. Specific day. Eliza's waiting for her inheritance. He's racing his horse, interestingly named Post Boy, of
Oh,
course,
oh.
goes as he was Postmaster General of New York. And the purse was $100,000 for each race, 2 races, equivalent today,
Okay.
$100,000.
Oh, okay.
That's
And
still insane.
his
Well,
his horse won both races, $100,000 a pop. Eliza didn't get a dime. Even didn't even put that towards the inheritance. I mean, there is documentation like that where I tracked basically the last 50 years of Samuel Gouverneur's life
Right.
past his death to find out what he did afterwards too. Like when Monroe's plantation at Oak Hill sold, did Eliza's heirs get any of that?
Yeah.
Right.
It nothing. I mean, it was unbelievable. I did find many years after Eliza had died, there was a probate held, and her two of her grandchildren, because one had already died by this time, they got $799. I think that's what they got,
Wow.
and that's the only record I found of them getting anything. So anyway, wow, I'm sorry, I really went on a whew.
No,
But
No,
that's
just to let
it's
you know, it turned out to be a detective story. It was,
yeah.
yeah, I had a lawyer helping me interpret some of these deeds and court documents and things because I wanted to be sure, this looks pretty bad. Is it really as bad as I'm thinking?
sure.
Right.
And he's like, yeah, this is what it says. And Mariah signed that bill of sale, by the way.
Wow.
Whether she knew what she was signing, I
That we
don't
can't
know.
know. Right.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that this is about the brother-in-law, but because I wouldn't want to disparage him necessarily, given even your caveats on whether or not this may or may not be true. But the thing about cockroaches is that they survive a lot of things. Not saying that that's making an analogy towards him.
Just on a side note. Yeah.
Yeah, just a side note is
Little
that's
biology
just
trivia.
the worst part about them is
Yeah.
that they survive. Um,
So we now have Eliza. She's in Paris. She probably couldn't come home if she wanted to because she has no money.
Right.
yeah,
She dies. Doesn't get to see her grandkids again. She
probably because
dies.
the recommendation for the treatment of the medical malady that she may or may not have had, tuberculosis, didn't. Spoiler: sea
Didn't work. Yeah.
voyages don't help tuberculosis. Just
At least not back then.
Unfortunately.
I don't know what they do now, but
Right?
I just think
Yeah. So
yeah.
that didn't work. She's stuck in Paris. She has no money. She passes away. Her family is in Baltimore. What happens to her body? Does she get a funeral? Does she, where is she buried? What happens?
It was the custom at that time, and they may still do it, that Americans who died in Paris, there was notification made to the United States Embassy in Paris.
Hmm.
Okay.
So the embassy was notified of her passing, and the man who got her name was Daniel Brent, which just knocked me off my chair because Daniel Brent had worked in Monroe's administration in the
Oh,
State
Hmm.
Department through Monroe's 8 years. So he knew Monroe, he knew that name.
right.
Um, and he, out of his own pocket, he arranged a funeral mass for her.
Mm-hmm.
She had converted to Catholicism later in her life, and I found the only document that we have for that. An archivist in Paris at Saint Philippe de Roule found that for me. I suspected she attended that church because it was only 300 meters from where she died at 62 Champs-Élysées.
Mm-hmm.
So they found that document for me that documents her funeral mass there. Daniel
Mm.
Hmm.
Brent arranged that. He was Catholic. His uncle was the first Archbishop of the United States. So
Hmm.
his whole family was Catholic, the Brent family and the Carrolls. Um, so he arranged her burial. He purchased the plot in Père Lachaise, and his letters they're very heartrending to read. He wrote to the Secretary of State at that time, John Forsyth, that he had arranged a funeral procession that was not worthy of her station. He was clearly aware of who she was.
Hmm.
But he also did an inventory of her effects, which seems to be typical. I reviewed a year's worth of records from the United States Embassy at that time, and that seemed standard procedure that someone at the consulate would initiate an inventory of effects and send those to America to family. And that's what proved also that she intended to return.
Right.
That's what we needed because I suspected, like I told you, that she wouldn't just go there to die. Well, now we know because all she had left when she died was two trunks of traveling possessions. So she had some
Mm.
Hmm.
clothing, she had some jewelry, some couple hair pieces, lace caps. She didn't have one household effect. not one furnishing, not even a candle holder
Hmm.
in her last effects. Just two trunks. She had some papers. Her will was there. So Daniel Brent took care of all of that for her, and that's how she ended up even having a grave. Now it was unmarked, but still,
Mm.
she had a proper burial at Père Lachaise. But knowing that, and that she wanted to come home, she intended to come home, it was just the right thing to do. You know, let's bring her home. Then it just was.
Yeah, so that bridges us right to, so what are
Yeah.
you doing now? So because
Oh
this
yikes!
is one of the few times that we have like breaking stories that are
Yeah.
currently happening on this podcast. Normally we're talking about things that have long have happened, but
Well,
this is occurring now.
Yeah.
This is
and I
exciting.
checked my email this morning to see if I had heard back from Paris, because I wanted to give you all like the first announcement, the scoop on this. Over a year ago, I started with the campaign. It's called the Bringing Eliza Home Project to bring her remains back. And I contacted Père Lachaise, and I won't get, that would be a whole nother broadcast about like what was involved with all of that and their paperwork and the French bureaucracy. But it's my honor to do it, so I'm not complaining. But basically, I had to find every living descendant of Eliza Monroe after 200 years.
Wow.
They all had
Okay.
to complete paperwork. I also had to find a descendant of Daniel Brent because he purchased the grave plot and he
Okay.
had no descendants. So I had to go through his will to his heir and then track his heirs. And he had 12 children, I think.
Oh
So,
gosh.
yeah, it was interesting.
Goodness.
And anyway, we found him. And then some wonderful women, Maureen and Catherine and Sue, volunteered to help me. And
Hmm.
they're doing fundraising. And I've been providing paperwork to Père Lachaise and going back and forth with them. So the last final bit of papers, it was almost 200 documents total, went to Père Lachaise. They received them October 24th. Everything is in order. The United States Embassy has hand delivered some of the papers for me. The deputy consul general, actually, of the embassy delivered them. So the embassy is supporting this. We have congressional representatives on board, the James Monroe Museum, University of Mary Washington, James Monroe Memorial Foundation. Oh gosh, Highland, of course.
Hmm.
Many organizations are actively supporting this effort and endorsing it. So now we're just waiting for the approval. And once they check
Hmm.
off that everything is as it should be, I have a funeral home on standby in Paris, a funeral service that will exhume and transport the remains in 4 to 6 days. Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond is
Hmm.
prepared to reinter her at the James Monroe plot, along with
Mm.
Monroe and her mother and her sister. So she'll be there. And we have a funeral home in Fredericksburg, and Sons, a Found and Sons funeral home, which is very graciously offered to handle everything
Mm.
regarding her remains this side of the Atlantic for us, pro bono. So we're ready to go. I've talked to Customs. I've talked to the Metropolitan Airport Authority. She'll be arriving at Dulles. I mean, as soon as we get the
Wow.
yes, I got a list of people to call, man.
You
We're rolling.
you have done a lot.
Oh, thank you. It's been my honor. Really,
It's
it has to do this.
it's amazing, but you're still not quite there yet because you're still looking, you're still raising money to get this final push. So do you want to tell us about the website and where our listeners can go if they want to donate and actually take part, by helping bring Eliza home?
Bring a president's daughter home.
Right.
Thank you, Alice, for the opportunity to share this information.
Yeah.
We do have a Facebook page, Bringing Eliza Home. Our web page is being sponsored through the Historic Fredericksburg Foundation Incorporated, HFFI, and that is at hffi.org backslash bringing dash Eliza dash home. And that will take you directly to our page. And there is a section for donations and a button, to push and all of that. So yeah, that would be wonderful because it's going to be thousands of dollars.
Absolutely.
We've already incurred, which is fine. We've been happy to do that, but Père Lachaise required professional translations that were certified into
Hmm.
French for some of the documents and things like that. So we've done all of that. So any any assistance would be very much appreciated.
And we'll have those hyperlinks in our show notes. So no matter where you are, no matter where you're listening or watching this, you can go down to our show notes. We'll have the links right there. So you just have to click, and I'm sure any little bit will help.
Yes, thank
It,
you.
anything will help to bring her home.
If you're listening, if this is interesting to you, please go check it out, find out more information, and if you have the means to do so, please donate. It's a very cool story. It's very rare. At the top of the episode, I said it's very rare for these kinds of things to happen. One, for um, a history to be so catastrophically misunderstood,
Mm-hmm.
and then have some means to, I know it's postmortem, but rectify that, you know,
Right. And to someone to
injustice,
take the
or
effort and time
yeah,
to do that, like Barbara's done.
Well, I think it's important for women's history in general too, because you know that if this kind of thing happened to
yeah,
Eliza, the daughter of a president, who was at the mercy of a man who was holding these purse strings,
Right.
you know what happened to other women. And if we can make it right for one, if we can make it right for just one. If we can get Eliza home, it would, I don't know, be very gratifying. If I'm going to get all flicklimped here. But, after 5 years, I feel like I know her, even though, I mean, I
yeah.
didn't really,
Absolutely.
but, when you read someone's personal letters and know what they've been through. But anyway, it's very meaningful.
This could be the start of something big as far as looking into other women.
Oh, yeah, good point.
I know, before we started chatting, Barbara was giving her caveats about like how she's, not a professional historian, this, that, and the other. And I think your attention to detail, your pursuit of the facts via primary sourcing, all of this stuff is, you've done everything
Yeah. And more.
Thank
that
you.
and
Consulting
more
lawyers.
that yeah, and consulting lawyers, yeah, like that professional historians do.
Thank you.
So we were very, really pleased to have you on as a guest, and to talk about this. This is such a cool story, and like I said, very unique,
Absolutely.
in what we
And
get to do.
we'll absolutely keep our listeners and our followers on social media updated, because this is something that could be happening soon. So, we'll hopefully people will contribute, but then also as things update, we will absolutely let people know when Eliza's coming.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful. We're hoping for the reinterment to happen at the end of February or early March, because we're anticipating, within a few weeks before Christmas, we're anticipating having the approval. Um,
It's so exciting.
we're
That'd be a great
hopeful.
Christmas
We're
present.
hopeful. Yeah, it'll be a
Yeah.
great Christmas present. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Barbara. And as always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. And the free tier of our Patreon membership gives you access to our Discord, where you can get in touch with Lynn and I directly, and also communicate with some of the historians that we've interviewed. And we will make sure that on that Discord, we will continually give updates on the Bring Eliza Home
Thank you.
campaign, and what's going on there. So if you wanted to keep up with that,
Absolutely.
feel free. We will make sure that our Patreon members are kept up to date. But if you want to go check that out, it's patreon.com/primary source media. That's patreon.com/primary source media. And also, Lynn and I are new entrance into the Blue Sky. If you're on Blue Sky,
Yes.
Mhm.
check it out. Lynn and I are now over there, using that pretty frequently. So
We
hoping to
are.
get in touch with you all on that platform as well. Now, Barbara, thanks so much for being with us. This is amazing.
Thank you so much. You all have been wonderful. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Barbara. And we're also going to put a link to your book in our
Oh
show notes.
yes,
So
yes, of
go
course.
buy Barbara's book as well to learn even more about what you've heard here today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.